Welcome to part 4 of this video series on the muscular system. This is the second video in which we will explore exactly how the nervous system stimulates skeletal muscles to contract. By the end of this video, you should be able to describe how energy production is managed during exercise, and you should be able to describe more effects of exercise on muscle fibers. So now that we've talked about the different muscle fiber types and we've kind of looked at how the characteristics of these muscle fibers is related to how they make ATP, let's talk about how ATP is made during exercise. So as you know, ATP is the only source of energy that's directly used for contractile activities. This goes back to the cross-bridge cycle that we looked at previously. Now, inside of a cell, there's only enough ATP to sustain contraction for about 4 to 6 seconds. This means that there have to be ways of synthesizing ATP, and that's what we want to look at now. There are 3 main ways of making ATP for a muscle cell. We've already said that aerobic cellular respiration is one, so that's kind of the last one on this list. But there are 2 ways that cells can make ATP in the absence of oxygen. They are direct phosphorylation of ADP by creatine phosphate and glycolysis. If you've watched the videos from this series in order, you know that there are 2 types of muscle fibers. When we need to use our skeletal muscles to move, the type 1 fibers that are responsible for lower intensity but sustained movement are recruited first. If they aren't strong enough, then the type 2 fibers that are capable of short duration but more intense or explosive movements are recruited. These type 2 fibers use anaerobic methods to produce energy. And of course, when we say energy, we mean, that's right, ATP. Initially, ATP is used, or is made rather, using direct phosphorylation. Phosphorylation occurs when an enzyme or some other catalyst removes a phosphate from one molecule and adds it to another. In a muscle cell, the enzyme is called creatine kinase. Creatine kinase binds another molecule called creatine phosphate and removes the phosphate from it, producing creatine as a waste product. But what happens to the phosphate? The phosphate gets added to adenosine diphosphate, or ADP. Remember, this is a waste product that's produced when ATP gets hydrolyzed or broken down. So when creatine kinase adds a phosphate to adenosine diphosphate, we regenerate ATP. So this is a one-step reaction that's catalyzed by the enzyme. So it's a fast way of making energy. A second anaerobic pathway that muscle fibers can use is called glycolysis. And we've already looked at this in the last video. But briefly, we're going to take glucose, and this glucose could come from glycogen breakdown, or maybe it's brought to the muscle fiber via capillaries. But the glycolysis enters the muscle fiber and goes through a series of 10 chemical reactions which split glucose into 2 molecules of a waste product called pyruvic acid. Along the way, there's a net gain of 2 ATPs. Now, after glycolysis is over, there are a few extra chemical reactions that have to happen, and one of the products of those chemical reactions is lactic acid. Lactic acid gets released into the blood, and then the blood carries that lactic acid to the liver, the kidneys, and the heart, where it can be used as fuel, or in the kidneys, it can alternatively be converted into pyruvic acid. And pyruvic acid, you may remember, can be used in the Krebs cycle as a source of energy. Now, type 2 muscle fibers aren't the only ones capable of anaerobic ATP production. At about 70% of maximum contractile activity, your muscles bulge so much that they compress the blood vessels around them, and this reduces oxygen delivery to all of your muscle fibers. In this case, type 1 fibers, which usually do aerobic cellular respiration, may convert or switch to use glycolysis for ATP production. Aerobic cellular respiration is the third way that muscle fibers may make ATP. Now remember, we only see this in your type 1 fibers and one particular group of type 2 fibers. To make things simple, I'd like for you to think about aerobic cellular respiration being only associated with the type 1 fibers. But if you want to go a little bit further, you might want to remember that there's one group of type 2s that can also do this. Now, we've already been through aerobic cellular respiration also in the last video, so I just want to summarize it here. In aerobic cellular respiration, glucose, which comes down from the breakdown of food, and then the glucose enters the bloodstream and it's brought to the muscle fibers via capillaries, or glucose that comes from the breakdown of glycogen within a muscle cell, goes through glycolysis, producing pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid then gets converted into a series of electron carriers called NADH and FADH2. Those move to the mitochondrion of the cell and they are converted into ATP. By the time all of this happens, we make a total of about 34 ATPs, but some of them get used up during the process of transporting NADH into the mitochondrion. So you might think about us making 32 ATPs, okay, per glucose this way. Don't forget though that we made ATP using glycolysis in the Krebs cycle as well. So by the end of all of this, we probably have somewhere around 34 to 36 ATPs being produced. Now with aerobic cellular respiration, sugar in the form of glucose isn't the only way that we can make ATP. There are mechanisms to convert fatty acids into ATP using the Krebs cycle, okay, and amino acids as well. So all of that can enter this pathway at the Krebs cycle, and that means that fatty acids and amino acids could be used to make ATP as well. So you can see that this is kind of the best way for the cell to make energy because we get lots of energy from all these different types of molecules. So now let's talk about how ATP is managed during exercise. If we're doing a short duration exercise where we're using a lot of energy and we're trying to sustain forceful movements for a short period of time, think about sprinting, for example, then here's what happens. The first source of ATP is going to be ATP that's already in the muscle fibers. That will sustain activity for about 6 seconds. Then there's a switch over to that creatine phosphate system that I mentioned. That was the direct phosphorylation pathway. This will sustain activity for another 10 seconds. So your first 16 seconds of activity is ATP in the cell and then ATP from direct phosphorylation. Then there's another switch to glycolysis. So in the next 30 to 60 seconds, okay, glycolysis provides ATP. Now, how does this happen? Well, glycogen that's in the cell gets broken down into glucose. This is a process called gluconeogenesis. So gluco refers to glucose, neo means new, and genesis means to make or the beginning. So this is going to provide glucose, and then that glucose gets oxidized in glycolysis. We make a little bit of ATP plus some lactic acid, and that lactic acid can then be made into pyruvic acid. So for short duration exercises of about a minute or so, this is where your ATP is coming from. If you're doing longer duration exercise, then there's a conversion to that aerobic cellular respiration system that I mentioned, where glucose is broken down well, not just glucose, but glucose, your fatty acids, and amino acids from proteins, they all can be broken down to make energy through three pathways. That was glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. The problem with this process is it requires oxygen. The other three that we talked about, the ATP use from the cell, the creatine phosphate, and glycolysis, all of those are anaerobic, so they don't require oxygen. But aerobic cellular respiration does. So this means that oxygen has to be released from myoglobin that's in the muscle fiber, okay? Or it has to be released from hemoglobin, which is flowing through the capillaries that are associated with your muscle fibers. Either way, there has to be oxygen for aerobic cellular respiration to work. Why does the cell want to use this method? Well, it's slow because look at all the pathways you have to go through, but it makes a lot more ATP. Okay. Now, as you might remember from a few slides ago, if you're working out really hard and you're at about 70% of your contractile maximum, then your muscles will bulge so much that they may start cutting off blood flow. In that case, these fibers, these type 1 fibers that are primarily doing the aerobic cellular respiration, they will convert back to those anaerobic methods of ATP production. After an especially long or intense workout, how does your body feel? Mine usually feels very heavy. My muscles don't feel like they want to move, and I sometimes feel like I want to nap. A delicious, restful nap. One that makes me feel like I was asleep for 3 hours when it was only one. Well, what's causing that? Muscle fatigue. Fatigue is the inability to maintain a given level of intensity during activity. It's the inability to contract your muscles the way you want to. And fatigue is caused by a number of factors. Key among them are the depletion of important metabolites like creatine phosphate, glycogen, and glucose, which are all involved in ATP production. Remember, if you don't have enough ATP in your muscle fibers, then they can't complete the cross-bridge cycle and contract. You'll also have ionic imbalances involved. Remember, the ability to contract your muscles and even do the cross-bridge cycle at all is related to the flow of calcium and sodium across the plasma membrane, intracellular calcium levels, and the presence of inorganic phosphate. Imbalances in all of these different ions can interfere with that excitation-contraction coupling that we talked about a few lectures ago. Prolonged exercise also damages the sarcoplasmic reticulum and it interferes with calcium regulation. So calcium may be released and then pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it may not be pumped out again as easily. You also have decreased availability of oxygen to your muscle fibers. So that means that the muscle fibers may not be able to produce as much ATP to drive cross-bridge cycles and allow contraction. You also have the accumulation of waste products in your muscle cells like ADP, calcium, and phosphates. And then of course you have the environmental conditions like extreme heat, sweating, and then maybe there are electrolyte disturbances associated with that as well. After exercise, it takes some time to return the body to its pre-exercise state, and this is called the recovery period. During the recovery period, there's usually an increased rate of breathing, and that's called the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. EPOC is the mechanism that allows the body to recover from exercise-induced homeostatic imbalances. So it's during EPOC that you're going to have a return to your normal body temperature. Again, when you exercise, about 40% of the energy and ATP is actually used for muscle activity and work. The remaining 60% is given off as heat. So getting rid of this heat is why your skin gets hot and flushed when you work out. It's also why you sweat profusely. And so you'll see this during the recovery period. You'll also see that during exercise, your cells get depleted of oxygen. So EPIC helps to restore. It increases the amount of oxygen in your blood to help restore oxygen levels in your cells, including the myofibers. Then don't forget, on the last slide I mentioned that you have some ion imbalances. Those also get restored, and blood pH gets restored as well. In addition to these things, slowly your glycogen stores will get replenished, glucose gets replenished, and then your reserves of ATP and creatine phosphate also get replenished. The conversion of lactic acid to pyruvic acid can lead to the replenishment of glucose and glycogen. So your recovery period is really important for restoring the normal state of your body. After you've participated in intense exercise, you might experience DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. This phenomenon follows exercise, and for a lot of years it was thought to be due to the accumulation of lactic acid in your muscles. Current research suggests instead that it's more likely due to structural damage. So when you work out and exercise, you actually make little rips and tears in your muscle fibers. This is particularly true for those isotonic eccentric muscle contractions. So the pain that you feel is due to inflammation from your muscle fibers undergoing repair after these little tiny tears have been made in them. The most effective treatment for DOMS is actually more exercise, but gentle exercise. Unfortunately, once you stop exercising, usually the soreness will return until the muscle is repaired. And you can expect that this is going to keep happening until the muscles are conditioned to withstand the stress that you're putting on them through exercise. So for example, if I exercise for an hour every day, then for the first week or two afterwards, I'm probably going to get this delayed onset muscle soreness. But after a couple of weeks, as my body gets more conditioned and more used to be exercising for an hour, I'm going to notice that I either don't get it sore or I don't get sore at all. That's what this means. There are ways that you can temporarily lessen the soreness. You can, for example, undergo massage, which increases circulation or blood flow to the muscles, and that speeds repair. There are topical therapies like icy hot that you can put on, kind of cools or warms the skin and lessens your ability to sense the pain, at least temporarily. Some people say that acupuncture helps. And then, of course, there are oral medications like ibuprofen, Aleve, things like that. But they don't show any long-term benefit. They just help you not feel the pain for a few hours. That's it. So in this video, I've talked about how energy is produced when we exercise. Remember, during short-term exercise, the energy that's produced in your muscle fibers is through anaerobic means, but when you're doing longer duration exercise, the primary source of ATP is going to be aerobic cellular respiration. I've also talked a little bit about the effects of exercise on your muscle fibers. I hope this video was incredibly useful to you. I think it's a bit more practical than some of the other videos that I've done, but this material could show up on your exam. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm more than happy to help you out. Our next series of videos will be on the nervous system, and I can't wait. I'll see you there.